Who raised you more? Your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
I still remember the exact moment when the realization hit me, not because anyone said it directly to my face, but because the way they spoke, the way they acted, left no room for interpretation, and it was that suffocating feeling of being dismissed. The kind that seeps into your bones and makes you question everything you've done up until that point, that made me finally see the truth about my family, that I would always be invisible no matter how much I tried, no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I sacrificed. And it happened the day my parents decided that Emily, my younger sister, would receive a brand new home entirely paid for by them, while I was casually reminded over dinner that I wasn't entitled to anything. As if my entire life's effort and my careful attempts to stay close to them had amounted to nothing more than invisible noise, a background hum that they could ignore whenever they pleased, and I had to swallow the lump in my throat, nod politely, clear the plates, and walk out of the room with my pride intact, but my heart quietly breaking, because it had become painfully clear that nothing I did would ever earn their recognition or their support. I had spent my entire adult life trying to prove myself to them, always following the rules, always making the right choices, going to school, working hard at my job, saving money, planning my future responsibly, all the while silently hoping that someday they would see me as more than just the elder daughter who was expected to manage life responsibly and yet was never celebrated for it. And yet here I was, watching them hand my sister a house that I would never see in my name, that I would never be invited to feel proud of. And it was in that moment, standing in my quiet apartment with the echo of their voices still lingering in my ears, that I realized the anger I had been trying to suppress for years was no longer something I could ignore. And instead of breaking down or lashing out, I felt an unexpected clarity, a cold and precise understanding that if I wanted justice, if I wanted to be acknowledged, if I wanted them to finally understand what it felt like to be powerless, while someone else they favored thrived, I couldn't rely on them to do the right thing or even to acknowledge my worth, and I had to take matters into my own hands in a way that was calculated, deliberate, and completely untraceable. I started small, paying attention to every detail of their habits, their preferences, the way they managed their finances, the people they trusted, the little inconsistencies in how they ran their lives that no one else seemed to notice. And I realized that their arrogance and entitlement were paired with an astounding level of carelessness when it came to the legal and financial structures they believed were untouchable, which meant that with patience and strategy, I could create leverage without ever putting myself at risk. And I began to map out what would eventually become a long-term plan designed not to humiliate anyone unnecessarily, but to ensure that they would be forced to acknowledge me, to respect me, and to finally feel the weight of underestimating someone they had dismissed for decades. I confided in my closest friend about the situation, not in an attempt to boast or to seek permission, but because I needed to verbalize the thoughts swirling in my head, the combination of hurt, frustration, and sudden determination that had taken root so deeply that it was impossible to ignore. And as I spoke, I could feel the tension in my body easing slightly, like the plan itself was already giving me a sense of empowerment I had never experienced with them. And I realized that this was the first time in years I felt truly alive in relation to my family, because for the first time, I had control over something that mattered to me and that they would never see coming. By the end of that week, I had started taking notes, recording subtle patterns, and mentally prioritizing the steps I would need to take in the coming months. And every time I thought about my sister laughing, blissfully unaware of the tension simmering under the surface, I felt a mix of satisfaction and impatience, knowing that her security and comfort, which my parents had so thoughtlessly handed to her, would eventually intersect with my carefully laid plans in a way that would not only prove my intelligence and resourcefulness, but would also force the entire family to face the consequences of their favoritism in a way that would leave them speechless and questioning how someone they had always overlooked could so completely outmaneuver them without a single misstep. And so I waited, quietly observing, making connections, planting seeds in conversations that would later grow into leverage, and silently building the foundation for a plan that would demand attention, respect, and acknowledgement. because I had spent too long living in the shadow of someone who had never earned the privileges I had been denied, and I realized that the only way to reclaim my dignity was not to fight them directly but to use patience, intelligence, and timing to make sure that, when the moment came, there would be no escaping the truth that I was the one who had been underestimated, ignored, and dismissed for far too long. And I would finally get the satisfaction of seeing my parents confronted with their own mistakes in a way that was undeniable, unforgettable, and completely deserved. After that evening when the truth of my parents' favoritism had hit me like a cold slap in the face, I made a decision that surprised even myself, because instead of lashing out or running away in anger, I resolved to take control of the situation in a way that would leave no room for doubt or retaliation, and I knew immediately that it would require more than mere emotion. It would demand patience, careful observation, and the willingness to quietly gather every piece of information, every connection, every opportunity that could eventually tip the scales in my favor, and I began to see my life not as a series of compromises and sacrifices designed to please them, but as a platform from which I could build a position of undeniable power. One that would allow me to reclaim my dignity while maintaining the appearance of calm and control that they would never suspect, because my parents had always assumed that I would accept their favoritism as an unchangeable law of our family, and they had never considered that I could be capable of long-term strategy and patience that would rival anyone else's. I started by reassessing every relationship and every professional connection I had built over the years, realizing that while my parents had assumed I was dependent on them emotionally and financially, in reality, I had quietly built a network of colleagues, mentors, and business contacts who respected me for my intelligence, my discipline, and my ability to handle complex situations without drawing attention. And I began to think about how I could leverage those relationships in subtle ways that would not only increase my financial independence, but also give me credibility and influence in circles that my parents had always assumed were out of my reach, which meant that with careful timing, I could create situations where they would be forced to recognize my competence, even if they did not want to admit it publicly or privately. At the same time, I began studying my parents' behaviors, noting patterns that revealed their vulnerabilities, the things they assumed were invisible, and the oversights they considered too small to worry about. And I realized that they had spent so many years operating from a position of entitlement that they had left themselves exposed in more ways than I could have imagined, because their confidence in their own control had blinded them to the fact that someone who had been underestimated for decades could quietly gather power and influence without triggering suspicion, and I knew that if I approached it carefully, I could position myself in a way that would allow me to manipulate circumstances in my favor without ever having to directly confront them, because the best revenge, I had learned from experience, was not the one that involved yelling or humiliation, but the one that left the other person speechless, confused, and painfully aware that they had miscalculated everything. About you. I also began paying attention to Emily in ways I had never done before, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I needed to understand the resources, the habits, and the decisions that my parents had given her access to, and in doing so, I noticed that while she had confidence, charm, and the kind of superficial intelligence that made her seem capable, she lacked foresight and the ability to navigate complex situations that required patience and planning, which meant that any advantage I gained would compound over time if I remained careful and calculated, and I started quietly planting small disruptions, subtle nudges that made her question her own stability without ever exposing my involvement. Because by undermining her in ways she would never notice, I could weaken the foundation that my parents had built around her, while at the same time preparing the stage for my own rise without anyone realizing that I was orchestrating events from behind the scenes. In parallel, I committed myself to financial and personal independence in ways that would give me leverage later, working overtime on projects, taking on new responsibilities that increased my visibility and reputation within my professional circle, and quietly saving money in accounts that my parents had no knowledge of, which created a growing sense of security that I had never felt before, because for the first time, I knew that I could act without fear of immediate retaliation, and that any move I made would be backed not by chance or luck, but by careful planning and the accumulation of resources that they had assumed I would never be able to access. And that realization gave me a quiet but profound satisfaction that was far more powerful than any immediate gratification I could have derived from confrontation or anger. By the time a few months had passed, I had mapped out a complex plan in my mind that involved multiple stages, contingencies for potential interference from my parents or Emily, and precise timing that would ensure that when the moment came to make my first significant move, it would appear completely natural, even inevitable, to everyone involved. And as I reviewed my strategy late one night, I felt a surge of anticipation that was mixed with patience, because I understood that the real power lay not in rushing to act, but in waiting until the exact right opportunity presented itself, and I knew with absolute certainty that when it did, my parents would be forced to face the consequences of their favoritism and their arrogance. And that moment would mark the first step in a carefully calculated plan that would ultimately restore my dignity, assert my confidence, and leave them speechless in a way they would never forget, and I could not wait to see the expressions on their faces when they finally realized that I had been quietly preparing for this moment all along. By the time I had gathered enough information and carefully analyzed every possible weakness in the web of control my parents had spun around Emily and themselves, I knew it was time to start taking the first deliberate steps. Not in a way that would be immediately visible or aggressive, but in a way that would quietly shift the balance of power in my favor, and I began by reaching out to contacts I had maintained over the years, carefully cultivating their interest in potential projects that I could lead or influence, while framing these opportunities in ways that aligned with their own ambitions, knowing that once they invested in me or relied on my expertise, I would gain credibility and leverage that my parents had always assumed I lacked. And as I spoke to them, I noticed an energy in myself that I had not felt for years, a sense of purpose and control that contrasted sharply with the helplessness I had felt when my parents had handed Emily a house without a second thought. Because for the first time, I was no longer waiting for recognition. I was engineering it with precision and patience that they would never see coming. At the same time, I began to plant subtle seeds in my family's interactions, making casual comments about my own achievements, sharing accomplishments in a way that seemed innocuous, but was carefully calculated to register with my parents and others in our circle, and I watched closely as their reactions varied between mild surprise, subtle discomfort, and barely concealed annoyance, which gave me confirmation that my presence and influence were slowly starting to make an impact, and I understood that every small nudge, every carefully worded story, was creating a ripple effect that would magnify over time and eventually force my parents to reconsider their assumptions about my capabilities and my worth. Because their sense of control depended entirely on the belief that I would always accept their favoritism without objection, and once that illusion was challenged, the ground beneath them would begin to shift in ways they could not anticipate. I also began to observe Emily more deliberately, noticing the ways she made decisions and interacted with others, and I realized that her confidence, which had always seemed enviable to me, was built largely on assumption and habit rather than true understanding or strategic thinking, which meant that if I applied pressure carefully, I could exploit gaps in her judgment without ever directly confronting her. And I started leaving subtle hints of opportunities, gently guiding her toward choices that would temporarily appear advantageous, but that I knew would eventually reveal vulnerabilities. Because the key to my strategy was not to attack outright, but to guide outcomes in ways that would highlight her reliance on the resources and privileges she had received from our parents, while demonstrating, indirectly, that I possessed the foresight and control she lacked, and I could see the first signs of uncertainty creeping into her behavior as she began to question whether she was truly in charge of her own success, which was exactly the effect I wanted to achieve at this stage. In parallel, I continued to build my financial independence in ways that were invisible to my parents, securing accounts, investments, and small business opportunities that would give me real power when the time came to execute the more critical stages of my plan, and I began documenting everything meticulously, keeping mental and written notes of conversations, patterns, and reactions. because every detail, no matter how small, could later be used to reinforce my position and ensure that my moves would appear intentional and undeniable. And as I worked through these layers of preparation, I realized that my sense of satisfaction was no longer tied to immediate recognition or validation, but to the certainty that I was quietly constructing a situation where I would be in control, and when the day arrived to make my first significant reveal, there would be no chance for my parents to dismiss, ignore, or counteract what I had accomplished through careful planning and disciplined execution. I began to feel a sense of power that was both exhilarating and grounding because it came from preparation, intelligence, and the patient accumulation of resources and influence rather than from luck, emotion, or confrontation. And I noticed that my confidence was beginning to affect my everyday interactions, making me more assertive, more deliberate, and more strategic in the way I presented myself to colleagues, friends, and even strangers, which in turn reinforced the sense that I was capable of navigating complex dynamics and capable of influencing outcomes in ways that my parents had never considered possible, and that growing awareness of my own agency made every minor victory, every subtle acknowledgement from someone else, feel like a brick laid in the foundation of a larger structure that would eventually tower over the assumptions and favoritism that had constrained me for so long, because in my mind, each move, each calculated decision was another step closer to the moment when they would be forced to confront the reality that I had been underestimated and dismissed for decades, and that they had no choice but to recognize the consequences of their actions, whether they liked it or not. And as the first small victories began to accumulate, as I watched the reactions of both Emily and my parents, I understood that I was no longer simply preparing revenge. I was creating a carefully controlled narrative in which their assumptions, arrogance, and favoritism would be exposed without a single dramatic confrontation, because by the time they realized what had happened, it would be too late for them to challenge, reverse, or even comprehend the scale of my strategy, and that knowledge, the certainty that I had orchestrated the initial stages of a plan that would eventually leave them speechless and forced to acknowledge my intelligence and capability, was the first true moment of empowerment I had felt in years. And it was more satisfying than I could have imagined, because it confirmed that I was no longer the person who waited for permission or recognition, but someone who could define her own fate, manipulate outcomes, and make them see, finally and undeniably, that the person they had dismissed all these years had been quietly in control from the very beginning. After months of careful observation, subtle manipulations, and deliberate patience, I finally reached the stage where the foundation I had quietly built allowed me to begin taking actions that would directly challenge the assumptions my parents and Emily had about me. And I approached these moves with the same level of meticulous planning I had applied to every previous step, ensuring that each action would advance my position without revealing the extent of my control or the sophistication of my strategy, because I understood that the moment they recognized my intention prematurely, it could compromise everything I had worked toward. And I had learned through years of being underestimated that the element of surprise was the most powerful tool I possessed, as it would not only maximize the impact of my actions, but also magnify their psychological effect on my family, forcing them to reckon with the reality they had refused to acknowledge for decades, which was that I was capable, intelligent, and strategically ruthless in a way they had never anticipated. The first tangible move came when I identified an opportunity to insert myself into a project within my professional network that not only promised financial gain, but also positioned me in a way that would visibly demonstrate my capabilities to a wider audience, including mutual acquaintances and family friends who my parents often consulted for advice. And by taking the lead in this project and executing it with precision and confidence, I was able to establish credibility that my parents could not ignore, because it became increasingly apparent to anyone paying attention that I was competent in ways that Emily, despite her advantages, had never been. And I could see the subtle shifts in my parents' reactions as they were forced to process the evidence that their long-standing assumptions about me were no longer accurate, and I savored the growing tension that accompanied their cognitive dissonance, because it meant that my plan was progressing exactly as I had intended, with every action reinforcing the notion that I had been underestimated at my own risk. At the same time, I began to deploy subtle, calculated challenges within the family dynamic, initiating conversations and situations where Emily's lack of foresight and depth became increasingly visible, but in ways that appeared natural and unintentional to everyone else, because I knew that the most effective way to undermine her position was not through confrontation, but through the exposure of weaknesses she could not hide. And I carefully orchestrated moments where her overconfidence led to mistakes that were witnessed by others whose opinions my parents valued, which slowly chipped away at the aura of competence and entitlement that they had granted her, and I watched with quiet satisfaction as she began to show signs of frustration and self-doubt, which only served to reinforce the growing sense that the balance of power within the family was beginning to shift, and that I was increasingly in control of the narrative without ever having to make my presence overtly known. In parallel, I continued to strengthen my financial independence and strategic leverage, consolidating resources, solidifying alliances, and preparing contingencies that would allow me to escalate my plan without fear of interruption or failure. Because I understood that true power came not from a single action but from the accumulation of multiple, carefully timed moves that together created an unstoppable momentum, and as I executed these steps, I began to see the early signs of the payoff, including subtle acknowledgments from colleagues, quiet reassessments of my capabilities by those who had previously doubted me, and the small but telling expressions of unease on my parents' faces whenever my accomplishments were mentioned, all of which confirmed that the plan was unfolding according to my design, and that the stage was being set for a confrontation in which I would emerge as the undeniable victor, forcing them to acknowledge a truth they had long refused to see, that I had been underestimated at their peril. The culmination of this phase arrived when I orchestrated a situation in which Emily's decisions directly intersected with my own, creating a scenario where her miscalculations were exposed in a way that benefited me. Because I had positioned myself strategically to capitalize on every opportunity, and I watched as the consequences of her errors became evident not only to her but to my parents and others who had always assumed she was the capable one. And in that moment, I felt a surge of vindication that was tempered not by malice, but by the satisfaction of seeing justice manifest itself through careful planning, intelligence, and patience. Because this was not about hurting anyone for the sake of cruelty, but about reclaiming a space of respect, recognition, and authority that had been denied to me for decades. And as I observed the subtle shock on my parents' faces and the confusion in Emily's eyes, I realized that the first major step in my revenge had succeeded exactly as I had envisioned, setting the stage for the final moves that would leave them speechless and forced to acknowledge that I had been quietly in control from the very beginning, and that the consequences of their favoritism and underestimation were now fully unavoidable. By the time I had positioned myself for the ultimate reveal, I had spent years building credibility, gathering resources, and orchestrating situations that would expose the blind favoritism and assumptions that had allowed my parents to hand Emily privileges and recognition while denying me the same, and I approached this final stage with a careful balance of precision, patience, and calculated audacity, knowing that the impact would only be complete if every move appeared natural, inevitable, and utterly undeniable, because the true brilliance of revenge, as I had learned, lies not in immediate confrontation but in creating circumstances in which the consequences of previous actions become unavoidable and visible to everyone involved. And as I set the final pieces in motion, I felt a mixture of anticipation, satisfaction, and almost reverent focus, because I understood that this moment was the culmination of years of silent work, strategic planning, and deliberate restraint that my parents had never anticipated I could sustain, and that the outcome would fundamentally shift their perception of me in ways that could never be undone. The first step involved leveraging the financial independence and professional credibility I had cultivated in secret, quietly acquiring stakes in ventures, partnerships, and opportunities that intersected with areas of interest or influence in my family's social and business circles, so that when I acted, the results would appear sudden, yet perfectly timed, and the evidence of my success would be impossible to ignore, because it was not just about making a point, but about demonstrating control, intelligence, and foresight in a way that forced my parents to confront their own errors in judgment, and I orchestrated a meeting that seemed innocuous, yet was carefully designed to bring all relevant parties, including Emily, my parents, and key acquaintances, into a space where my influence would be undeniable, and where my preparation, execution, and quiet authority would be witnessed firsthand, leaving no room for dismissal or rationalization. When the moment came, I revealed the outcomes of my investments, decisions, and strategic moves, presenting them not as acts of defiance or vengeance, but as the natural result of competence, diligence, and insight. And I watched the slow dawning of realization on my parents' faces, the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts from casual confidence to stunned recognition, as they processed that the person they had dismissed and undervalued for decades had quietly outperformed and outmaneuvered both their expectations and the advantages they had lavished on Emily. And in that room, I felt the surge of validation that had been denied to me for so long, because the reactions were unfiltered, genuine, and undeniable. And they reflected a truth that could not be argued away. I had been underestimated at their peril, and now, in front of witnesses, the balance of authority and recognition had been recalibrated entirely in my favor. Emily's reaction was equally revealing, her confidence wavering as she realized that her successes, which had always seemed secure because of the privileges granted by our parents, were suddenly exposed as fragile and contingent upon assumptions she could not control, and I observed her processing this sudden shift in perception from those around her, seeing in her eyes the quiet acknowledgement that she had been outmaneuvered without any overt aggression on my part, because the real power had always been in foresight, patience, and intelligence rather than entitlement, and in that instant, I recognized that the emotional impact on both my sister and my parents was complete, because they could neither deny the facts nor diminish the force of the strategy that had brought me to this position, and the sense of triumph I felt was not rooted in cruelty, but in justice, validation, and the fulfillment of a plan executed with precision and patience. Finally, as the meeting concluded and my parents sat in stunned silence, struggling to process the reality that I had been quietly in control all along, I left them with a moment of reflection, knowing that the cumulative effect of years of favoritism, underestimation, and dismissiveness had now been fully revealed, and that they would carry the awareness of their misjudgment with them, because the consequences of their actions were now undeniable, public, and entirely inescapable. And as I walked away from that space, I felt an almost indescribable sense of closure, satisfaction, and empowerment, because I had taken control of a narrative that had long denied me recognition, turned every disadvantage into leverage, and ultimately forced those who had underestimated me to confront a reality they had never anticipated. And in that victory, I realized that the brilliance of this revenge was not in retaliation, but in the undeniable proof that intelligence, patience, and strategic action could overturn years of inequity, leaving my parents speechless, Emily humbled, and myself vindicated in a way that no apology, argument, or attempt at justification could ever undo.